So anytime you've tracked any data of importance, you come back to census data in some way. So statistical agencies like the census, they are actually required to produce what's called official statistics for use in public policy and decision making. In the US, census data are used to apportion political representation, to distribute funding, to uphold the anti-discrimination laws that we have. But that means that census data have all sorts of political consequences. They are constitutionally democracy's data infrastructure. But even when that political representation is not directly tethered to census data in certain ways, those data become contested in all sorts of notable things. So this is true in a lot of other countries as well. This is not just a United States phenomenon, even though the United States is unique in how it apportions politicians connected to the census. But the United Nations decided to actually build a standardization process around official statistics in order to formalize and professionalize this process. Frankly, because countries were making up data, right? And so the idea was that could you create a set of standards of what this would look like? But the professionalization of national statistics also created a series of other important questions. What are statistics if they're no longer just supposed to be political arithmetic? What do we do with the data? What happens about how we imagine what those data are supposed to do? So in most technical communities, it's really easy to think about those questions, the work of statistics, in a very objective, scientific, mathematical manner. The field of statistics is no longer understood in its political origins. It is understood as a set of mathematical techniques. So the ideal is one of combining objective information so that decision makers can then find comfort in dealing with this. But the comfort that they have in this objective data is the ability to move the political decisions onto the so-called objective data. And this allows people to avoid the politics of the data and the politics of decision making at the same time. To pretend like the data aren't really a part of the process, there's not data being made. And I want to argue that this is both dangerous in the thinking, but it's also how data get weaponized. An objective function also obscures the deeply problematic and political origins of many techniques we now take for granted. If you have ever done a regression, stop to think about what a regression is. It is a regression to the mean. What was the mean? That is eugenics logic rooted in the idea of whiteness as the idea of the mean and who was regressive to the mean. And yet we use this concept and we use this technique without critically interrogating its roots and what was baked into every aspect of it. So, by the way, the same guy who invented eugenics was the cousin of Darwin and is also the creator of most of modern day statistics. It's really great. So if you really want to get into the dubious roots, I will happily read books because the development of mathematical statistics has all sorts of different problems. But those problems did not end in the 40s. They did not end when people started to realize how costly this would be. In fact, all the way through the 1960s, we would take up that, and a lot of economic terms are also rooted there as well. So one of the things that ended up happening is how to actually start to calculate and make sense of that kind of information. So one of the things that happened for the Census Bureau is they wanted to figure out, given that everything in demography was moving towards these highly racialized and racist logics, could they come up with ways of understanding and pushing back on all of this? And what happens in 1910s, and this is often obscured within the history, but it was in the 1910s that a group of Black mathematical statisticians, statistical clerks at the Census Bureau, started to recognize that Black peoples were systematically undercounted in the United States. That probably should have been obvious by then, but they were recognizing that they wanted to put mathematical structures around that. And it actually took them a long time because of the culture of eugenics to be able to make that point. And it wasn't until the 1950s or 1940s when a white guy made the same claims that everybody started paying attention to this. Because what they started to realize is that in order to deal with this data, you had to understand its limitations and its problems in order to start making promises of repair. So most of the field of statistics actually gets birthed out of these different challenges, the ability to try to make it objective, but also to try to understand the limitations and make for repair. So with the idea of being able to produce higher quality statistics, government agencies began shifting to think about taking advantage of scientific knowledge and inverting it. Politically, that was also occurring at the same time. the idea of taking the questions of representation and making them crucial to the questions of anti-discrimination policy. But the same thing was also happening technically. Could we find a way to figure out how to improve the quality of the data by understanding its limits? In the United States, this was often met with political resistance. For example, the United States introduced a mechanism of sampling into the census in the mid-20th century because they thought that they may be able to deal with undercounted populations better if they could build sampling-based models. This, by the way, gets outlawed as a technique, in the early 2000s and cannot be used today for census contexts. So this is constitutionally outlawed by 57, there was a whole set of battles there around this. But the census also started doing other things, trying to fill in gaps. And one of the things you're going to start to see politically, because it's going to be the next big Supreme Court fight on census. By the way, a little hint, every time the Census Bureau changes its statistical methods, it ends up as a Supreme Court fight, which means you have to deal with those justices talking about statistics. This tends not to end well. But the one that's currently underway has to do with a procedure known as imputation. So what happens when you are missing data about a population? Because you can't collect the data about them, they're not there. And there was a really interesting Supreme Court case about the original imputation procedure, where they were like, it was one of the best combinations of a legal, technical, and social argument I've ever seen, where the chief demographer of the Census Bureau, who was pushing back and justifying, imputation is a procedure to actually take information about a known household and apply it to an unknown household. And he argued that to impute was essential because to not impute would be the equivalent of imputing 0 and producing a known undercount, right? Beautiful. And they were like, oh, I understand that. So they allowed the imputation to proceed. Well, imputation is under threat again because certain political factions are not very interested in imputation because certain populations are less likely to be counted. And so this has often been a way of trying to stop imputation to ensure that marginalized members of American society, primarily Black and brown individuals, were not counted. But this year's fight's getting even weirder because this time's fight in the 2020 census has to do with colleges. Because what happened in 2010 was that there was a political fight in 2010 about prisons. Prisons historically count for their geography, and many activists were like, hell no, because what happens is that people are then incarcerated right before the census in order to puff up the neighborhoods of the incarceration facilities. So many activists were like, no, let's take prisoners and reposition them back for the census on where they're actually from. Seems reasonable, right? Well, this was seen as the Democrats engaging in puffery, and the counter to this by the Republicans like, we'll give you the prisons in exchange that we want the colleges. So we want to count all college students, not at Providence, but back where you are from. That was a nice gesture in 2010. Problem in 2020 is the census secured on April 1, 2020. Guess what? People weren't at colleges. And so even though the residence rules were to count them here in the dorms, it's really about the dorms more than anything else, they weren't here. And so what happened is that the previous administration's FERPA ruling basically came back and said, we won't let the universities tell you the population. So the universities had to override FERPA around privacy laws to be like, no, here are our people. And so they didn't share the information. Then the Census Bureau, which finally got to actually do counting in person in August, couldn't show up at a dorm in August and count people. So for the first time ever, the dormitories around this country have been imputed. This means that they are a statistical approximation of what they would otherwise be. And that is a very, very big deal. It is a big deal because they're not allowed to use sampling either, which means this is not a model for all of you statisticians that you might know. This is a nearest neighbor assignment. It's weird. We're going to find out a lot more about it more. All right. So statistical agencies, are in this weird place because they're trying to produce this data. The statistics are getting arbitrated by politics. They're getting arbitrated by courts. And so who decides what constitutes statistical knowledge? Who decides what is a factual statistical process? Those who are invested in modern statistics and advancing science presume that the statistical agency would be able to create these procedures that they would be able to determine what is mathematically valid, that the output of the census should be the best quantitative measure of the country as possible. But not everyone sees the concept of statistics this way, and not everybody sees the work of a government agency this way. And so what you have is a contestation over what's happening. But the distinction and the way that this plays out in terms of what we imagine to be ideal data has a ton of consequences. So the moment that data matter, those data are never neutral. The greater the stakes, the less objective that those data could ever be. The very choice of what data to collect, how to categorize that data, how to present that data, reveal all sorts of ideological, social, political commitments, right? And in the United States, this is a sort of beautiful route when you look at the census, right? Because where did we start with in this country? We started this in 1790. The only piece of data that has been consistent since 1790, of course, has to do with the way we collect race, or just the very fact that we collect race. Because of two things. One is the atrocious commitment in our Constitution that imagined that enslaved peoples were 3/5 of a person. This is a compromise because the South wanted to include enslaved peoples as a full person for being sure to get as much political representation. The North did not want enslaved peoples to count as people because they didn't want to give the South that much political power. And that's how we end up with the egregious compromise. There's a weird inversion of this that made this data about race even more solidified, more structured, occurs in the 1960s when the Civil Rights era moves for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which all depend on having census data. So the race categories go from something that is entirely about keeping people out of political power to something that should be reclaimed to enable political power for anti-discrimination. Does it work out that way? We should discuss. But when institutions start to collect that data, there becomes politics to that collection. And there's also the politics about what is not collected, right? And it's the erasure and invisibility that also matters. France is sort of interesting in this equation because they outlawed collecting data about race and ethnic origin in 1978. And they banned the collection of data about religion in 1872, right? So this goes way back. This is viewed by proponents in France to say, well, this allows us to have a race-blind secular society. If anybody's visited France, that is not the way that I would describe France. So it also means that because they don't have this knowledge, they're ill-equipped to actually grapple with it. But the same thing is that what would be the categories that would be appropriate are also just as political. Of course, at least France still does a census. My favorite of all this is Lebanon, which hasn't done a census since 1932. Because in 1932, they concluded that there was a nice, comfortable balance between Shia, Sunni, and Christians, and they were done, right? So they've been apportioning their political groups this way since 1932, and they don't want to know what's happened since. Because this moment of not knowing creates all sorts of political risks for people in power. That also plays out true here. There's a reason that since 1977, we've been battling in the United States about whether or not to collect data about Middle East, North African populations, right? That's a hugely controversial issue. By the way, the Obama administration had approved that for the edits to the Statistical Directive 15. That was never put public under the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has not moved forward on any aspect. So many countries have laws that depend on the existence of data, but that doesn't guarantee that the data will exist. And that's also really tricky. So in the United States, there's a lot of verboten data in all sorts of different domains, right? You might know that it's verboten to collect data about guns in different ways. But you would think if it would be involved in the Constitution, that we would collect data about it. That would seem reasonable, right? But after the Civil War, the US passed a series of constitutional amendments that abolished slavery and thought about the different kinds of possibilities going forward. One of those pieces is a particular 14th Amendment law, which has three components to it. And most people remember the first two if you've been trained in American history, but never the third. Part one is the idea that anybody who was born in the United States is a citizen. This is a birthright commitment. Part two is the erasure of the 3/5 compromise, right? Which was not a compromise, but it was just a racist enactment. Those are the two everybody remembers. But there's a very interesting third clause to the 14th Amendment, which is that should a state prevent anyone aged 21 years or older from voting unless convicted of crimes, the federal government is supposed to subtract that total population from the census count. right? If they are unable to vote. Now, you might have filled out the census this year, hopefully, and you probably didn't say anything about whether or not you were allowed to vote. There's a reason. Congress has made it impossible to collect the data about who was not allowed to vote since 1870. That is another kind of knowledge that we purposefully don't know. Purposeful ignorance. So statistics help us know different aspects of our nation, different aspects of our communities. And what we're able to ask, what we're able to know depends on ideological, political, economic considerations. And we've seen this, by the way, on full display during the COVID era, right? Like, how do we actually know what we know about different communities? It depends on who's asking and how that material is asked. But the politics surrounding data aren't just about what data is or isn't collected. Politics also shape our ability to communicate the limits and dynamics of those data. So you go back to the fact that censuses are never perfect. Censuses miss people. They miss people because they are elsewhere, because they refuse to respond, because not everybody wants to be counted, because people didn't realize the residency rules. And they miss people in this legitimate fashion, but they also miss people that are deemed illegitimate by the state in all sorts of complicated ways, right? So they expose operational reasons, social reasons, and political reasons. So when official data then are understood as the objective gifts given by the state, they are presumed to be able to speak for themselves because they are presumed to be as accurate as was possible. They are presumed that they could then tell their story. But data don't speak for themselves. They can't speak that way. They speak on behalf of somebody else. They speak on behalf of the political considerations that went into their making. And those goals and values shape what is actually being said. So when policymakers and executives leverage data in order to justify their actions, they want that data to stay on message. As data is supposed to behave. And for data to stay on message, data must not communicate its warts, its limitations, anything that might possibly go wrong with that data. Data can't reveal anything that would undermine the confidence in the data. Data must be precise. Because if data were to be seen as weak, data that are viewed as weak would threaten the legitimacy not just of the data, but a whole statistical apparatus. So just like data must stay in line, so must data users. So researchers go and they dissect and analyze undercounts. They try to make sense of what happened in census data. And they make sense of all sorts of different kinds of data sets out there to build positions and to make sense of what's going on. But that doesn't mean that they are comfortable sharing or challenging the precision narrative. And a really interesting conversation with an applied demographer during my fieldwork. And she explained how, as a young demographer, she had gone in and she's like, oh, these data have limitations. And she first went, to the municipality, and she's like, I'm going to show you the limitations of this data so we can actually address this. And she was basically told to go find different data because clearly these data were all wrong. She's like, no, I can communicate with you confidence intervals and margins of uncertainty, and we can work with that. And it was absolutely removing. And to this day, she talks about how she's expected to produce facts. And the result is that she has to be very careful, even when she knows the data are limited, because she has to say everything as though it is precise. So anyone who has worked with data one time or another has asked data to speak. Just look at the data. And if you didn't do this at Thanksgiving, you always have really great conversations with family. She's like, Mom, just look at the data, right? And you're like, oh, I just caught myself doing that, right? Like I'm trying to get the data this week because I want to strangle my mom, right? I don't know if you've ever gone through that feeling, but that exasperation is one of the things that becomes a logic that is extended more generally. So when practitioners try to communicate the limitations of data, they have to deal with their own desire to push the responsibility onto the data. So when they're required to respond to decision makers who want who are often enumerate, and they want that data to speak in particular ways, they often ignore things. Ignore the uncertainty and error, because knowing that will cause all sorts of different kinds of confusion. And this is also really frustrating. So for anybody who's ever looked at the American Community Survey data, which is a sample-based survey that publishes a margins of error, almost all data users feed this in by dropping the column of margins of error. By the way, the American Community Survey is not the first sample-based survey of the Census Bureau. It's actually was called the long form. They didn't even bother publishing margins of error for the first 60 years, right? So the idea of even knowing this is often very hard. So consider what that means when we deal with other contexts like Poland. That was awful. That was a terrible thing. I didn't find the animated version, so I thankfully removed it. But like this thing jiggled all night because the only form of uncertainty was its jiggling. But it tried to communicate a message that was not about knowing what was going on in there. So political pollsters regularly put out things that actually tell this as though it is clear without laying out all of the different nuances and all of this. The result of which, unfortunately, is we end up with the wrong information. And then, by the way, when we're done, pollsters will come back and be like, "Oh, so the margins where?" And I'm like, "No, don't do that, right?" So the Census Bureau ends up being in this position where they're struggling because they're mathematically minded in all sorts of ways. They understand the limitations in their own data, but they recognize that that uncertainty can easily be politicized. And so the government scientists have to figure out how to communicate effectively and to tell what's information that's in those limits without undermining the legitimacy of their own apparatus. And that is particularly challenging when you have something like trying to do a census during a pandemic, right? It's extremely hard to figure out how to communicate this. So government researchers end up producing tons of follow-up analyses with lots of little footnotes down here. So if you're a scientist, you can go and find that they have told you somewhere very down in the small print that there is detail about the margins of certainty, but you don't necessarily know how to work with it. And most people aren't taught and socialized to work with it. Most machine learning models just erase that to keep going. So this creates this moment where when you have limits to the data, they ripple through the entire system. And so this moment comes to a head when you end up with a political conversation about whether or not we can even talk about this data. When the American Community Survey was first being discussed, people argued not to even ever allow margins of error to be published. But the illusion of the perfect census, in my mind, has become much more costly than I think people realize. Because without being able to grapple with the limitations of that data, the Census Bureau is unable to get the political and social support to really introduce new techniques that may challenge how people imagine the census to be. That's where we get to the statistical imaginaries. We imagine the census to do certain things. And that, in my mind, becomes this challenge because the social contract starts to dissolve as people think that the statistics of the state are doing different things. And that's what we're going to come back to in part 3, or part 4. So one reason why the census data are imperfect and have been imperfect for decades is because the census actually believes to be a responsible data caretaker. It turns out that people don't like giving government data. That's really kind of awkward, right? And from 1790 through to 1830, the Census Bureau did its fact checking by having people, having the U.S. Marshals, right? Law enforcement was who collected data, having U.S. Marshals go and publish all of that data on the bulletin boards in towns. And people would walk up and be like, dude, my neighbor, like this information, woo, okay. Turns out people didn't like that. And so by 1840, they started having conversations to be like, that's not going to fly anymore. And it particularly had to do with a variable that was collected around who in the household was insane, defined a little differently back then. And so there became this process where that became a business imperative to try to imagine statistical confidentiality. Well, the easy way to do it in the 19th century was to just not publish the data, right? Like just open it up. Because actually tabulating the data and sharing the data, you couldn't do a lot of detailed data work. So that became sort of the norm, was to not put this out for a long time. But then, this became such a norm, procedural norm, that people started talking about it. It became enshrined in law in the 1920s originally, and then formalized by the 50s. So law became the sort of backup to this norm that was used for business interests. But simultaneously in Europe, there was a whole other issue happening because statistical confidentiality was hitting a moral head. And what people understood in Europe was how frequently censuses were used in order to help the Nazi regime invade various territories. So what ends up happening is that moral logic starts to be a part of the census community, even if it's not the United States. It wouldn't be until the late 1990s and early 2000s when a group of historians realized that the United States also engaged in really bad behavior with the census during the 1940s, but that would take a while. But this all became this imperative to understand statistical confidentiality. And statistical confidentiality became all the more important when we started to think about how to actually proceduralize it. So in order to achieve statistical confidentiality, the first version was to just not publish the data. Then the next version was to figure out how you would choose what to publish. But there became more and more pressure to publish more and more data, and computers made it so it was easier to publish data. So by 1960, they actually made very concerted choices about how to suppress certain data that would be especially rich. But still, people wanted more and more data. And the 1990 census was when all of this hits a weird head, but an invisible one. In the 1990 census, by then there is pressure to make certain that you could produce small area geography data. And the Census Bureau was like, fine, we'll do it. But what they also did simultaneously, which was again in those footnotes and never really recognized, is that they started to inject noise into the census data for the first time. They injected noise, for all intents and purposes, arbitrarily. They would take and they would homogenize the geography. So the thing to know about a census tracts were not created based on geographies. They were created by containing as much racial homogeneity as possible. 100 years ago, continued through. So what happened is that the geographies were often drawn to maximize racial homogeneity. So when they were doing swapping in 1990, they were increasing the racial homogeneity as a way to try to make it so you couldn't see who was there. That was the first thing. And they did it here. It's called swapping is one of the techniques. There was something called blanket impute, which was basically blanket household, impute it by collecting the nearest neighbor and applying it. And there were a bunch of manual edits as well. This was being done 1990, 2000, 2010, but nobody was really paying a lot of attention to it, and it wasn't really having discussed. Except inside the Census Bureau, they started to see that there was a problem because of database reconstruction. So what happened is a bunch of computer scientists, realized that they could take the large-scale data that was available and make like major big Sudoku puzzle, right? Take statistical tabulations of billions of cells and piece it back together to produce individual records and determine who were all the individuals. Oh, and by the way, if you had access to commercial data, take that, match it, and you got name. That was really awesome. So computer scientists came to the Census Bureau in the early 2000s, so we can do this. And the Bureau went, that's not good. They decided they couldn't pull off any change in 2010, and for reasons I still don't entirely understand, they decided to still publish the small area geography rather than going back to table suppression, and held their nose, hoping that all would be okay. After the 2010 census, they did their own internal evaluation. Said, okay, how bad is it? Turns out 52 million people could be re-identified through this using only legitimate commercial data. It should make you a little concerned about what happens to the rest of it. So they went, well, that's not good. We can't pull this off. So they began down a path that they had done for other processes. So the Census Bureau had been paying attention to a procedure called differential privacy, which was created in 2006. And they had used this to unlock data, to make data available that were never previously available. Procedures like on the map, there's a ton of different systems that were available. So they had been building these systems internally since 2006. And they said, okay, could we use these same formal privacy mechanisms to protect the 2020 census? And the answer was, yeah, probably. So they began down that path. Well, unlike the previous one, this was a different kind of challenge because it meant that they were going to be removing some data from the public availability. It also meant that if anybody knows anything about differential privacy, and I don't necessarily say you should, there's certain governing processes, right? There are decisions that are made about how much you balance between noise, the amount of information that you sort of purposefully fuzz. Think of it like pointillism, you purposefully fuzz it one way, and how much you want to make certain you have real statistical accuracy. And like that is a balancing game. And that is balanced hinged on a Greek letter, because apparently these days we're liking our Greek letters in all sorts of different ways. And thank goodness this was not called Omicron, right? And so there's this funny balancing act that happens, because this is a governing protocol. But because it's a governing protocol, it's like, how do we do this from a policy place? And they thought that the answer to this was to involve more people in the process, but it becomes a huge challenge. Because the thing is there's some really critical assumptions that are rooted into differential privacy and what it means to do differential privacy. Assumptions that have nothing to do with the technology. The first assumption that we assume is that statistical confidentiality and usable statistics are both highly desirable and requirements, right? That's great, but not everybody believes that statistical confidentiality is a requirement, right? So that's a little awkward. The other thing is that they assume that if you actually introduce noise, that the answer is to do it in a non-arbitrary fashion, right? The previous versions had noise. It was just arbitrary.
What differential privacy allows is the ability to actually make sure you can measure it. And if you can measure it, you can communicate it. And if you can communicate it, then people can work with it, right? But that assumes that that is a conversation worth having. The other thing is that it assumes that transparency is something that we desire and relish and think is a good thing. Turns out when governments try to communicate what they're doing, they're doubted at every turn, right? Like, transparency doesn't necessarily result in the outcomes that computer scientists thinks it does. And so when the Census Bureau began integrating this, which they first did in 2006, they made all sorts of people happy because it made all of this data suddenly available. But when it was doing that and it used transparency to open up the conversation, they thought data users would be pleased more generally. But data users were not pleased when the Census Bureau announced that they would be introducing a systematic form of noise into the process. In fact, lawsuits began even before the data were released. And in those lawsuits, there were all sorts of fights about what was going to be legitimate, who got to control the data, what the data should look like. It was combined with the questions of imputation. It was combined with the questions of quality assurance. Because what we found was that most data users want data to speak for themselves. They want data as facts. So as we watch this work its way up to our courts, we're going to have this true epistemic fight. How do we know what we know? So, epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's an annoying term for this, but it's something we can hold on to when we remember how we know what we know. And the reality is that people know different things depending on their experience. Science is one pursuit of knowledge through a whole set of methods and defined procedures. Scientists have been often also convicted of heresy. Why? Because it's a different epistemology, one that is rooted in religion. Right? So you have these different ideas of what it means to produce knowledge. And one of the things that ends up happening is that knowledge is often challenged and tortured, disagreed politically, etc. So what does it mean to talk about sound science, sound data collection, etc.? So what we've seen is that there's a blatant abuse of this. And I happen to be a fan of a concept called agnotology. Agnotology is the study of ignorance. So if you think of ignorance in terms of scientific knowledge, that would be natural, what we don't yet know. But there are other kinds of ignorance as well. There's the ignorance of the forgotten knowledge, the things that we have lost. Think about indigenous knowledge that was lost due to genocide. But there's also that knowledge of, like, you know, that person you work with who left and no longer is here, and now you don't know how to actually work the coffee machine, right? So there's all sorts of different kinds of forgotten knowledge. But there's also polluted knowledge, knowledge that is purposefully made messy and destroyed. And when we think about polluted knowledge, the literature here goes back to the idea of climate change, for example. Climate scientists were reaching a point of consensus. They had a clarity on where things were going. They had an understanding. They were working within worlds of uncertainty in a comfortable way. And what happened was funded money came in and started polluting the science to try to increase the uncertainty and politicize the uncertainty in a way that would undermine what we know. And that politicization of uncertainty is where you see a reasonable desire to not want to get into battles of uncertainty. But uncertainty is central to the scientific process, and that's where we get to this contradiction, right? In a public policy context, in a politicized context, uncertainty is toxic and dangerous. In a scientific context, it's absolutely essential. And this is where the Census Bureau is placed in a very awkward position, as is any producer of data right now. This is true for the CDC, this is true for anybody who's doing climate data right now. This moment where you have to work within a world of uncertainty if you want to advance study of science, but you can't talk about uncertainty if you're going to deal with the politicians that will actually abuse it in different ways. So given that tension, the census has been in this, given this tension, the census has been in this really awkward place, right? Because census are infrastructural in our society, they are rooted in the political work, but they are also the things in which all these other systems downstream depend on. Those systems downstream need to grapple with uncertainty, but political work can't deal with uncertainty. And that means that when we actually have to do trade-offs, as is, for example, the case in differential privacy, where the goal is to produce statistical confidentiality, but also manage to have usable statistics, and we can't also talk about uncertainty, you end up in this whirlwind over which episteme is appropriate to actually hold on to. The more that we expect data to do this work for us, the more we lose control of being able to speak to the limits of data. And that's where I argue that an illusion is born. We start to imagine data in a different way. So I keep coming back to Jasnoff and Kim's ideas of a socio-technical imaginary. What they argue in this sort of famous text that's beautiful is that the state actually imagines future scientific and social technical realities. If we back up to 1787 when the census was created, this is an imagination of a possible future, right? And that is a socio-technical imaginary. And the idea is, what are those imaginations and what do we build based on those imaginations? Well, I argue that statistical imaginaries also get formed. We imagine the state's knowledge to exist in a certain way, to be precise, to be performed in a particular way. And when we do this, we start to imagine a form of a future that assumes a very simple linear path, one that actually can't deal with uncertainty, one that can't deal with having strong conversations of where things are going. And that's why I think that there's this huge challenge underway with regard to what's happening in the census right now. Because statistical imaginaries don't need to be far-fetched fantasies. They don't even have to be full illusions. But when they actually get fragmented, as what we're seeing right now, they become contentious. And that is the fragmentation of our current environment. So for me, this goes back to where the key to responsible data science is actually to keep the statistical imaginaries in check, to not allow them to fragment. Right? It's not just that there are three kinds of lies, lies, damn lies, and statistics. The reason that that exists is because of the politicization, because the imagination of what the data can tell us gets divorced from the political work. And I love, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. Right? This is this reminder that the work of working with data is really important. And that means that when we think about doing responsible data science, we need to deal with who's producing what illusions, why they are producing illusions, how to deal with those, how to categorize and make sense of those when we're building downstream systems. Because otherwise what happens is that if we treat these data as objective, if we treat them as neutral, if we go back and anchor our data on something else, we perpetuate all sorts of different problems. And it doesn't mean that the data have to be perfect, but when you know the limitations of the data, you can understand whether or not what you're doing and pulling forward makes sense. So keep in mind that all data are made, not found. The notion that data can be the product of an apolitical act is highly fantasy. But the reality is that it is a contested process and we need to pay attention to those contestations. We need to look at them. Data cannot be treated as givens. They must be understood in context. They must be understood for their limitations. And they must be lovingly engaged with. So my argument is that engaging with uncertainty is actually very risky business. People are afraid to engage with it, but it's absolutely essential to do so. Because if they just worry about the politicization of uncertainty, we actually lose the science. And that is actually where we're at risk right now, especially in survey data. Survey data is falling apart. People are not participating. The Census Bureau has been struggling, and they do better because they've got law on their side. They can fine people for not participating, and they're struggling to get people to respond. Polling data is off. Medical data is off. We have so many data sets that are filled with uncertainty, but because we don't talk about uncertainty, we can't understand the limits. We don't know how costly something is, and so we go into these existential panics, which obviously everybody's seeing this week. This is my argument is, as computer scientists, those of you who are, we have a role to play. We have a responsibility to figure out how to make sense of these data, to build techniques to deal with them. How are our data being used? How do you communicate this? It's one of the reasons I'm a big believer in data sheets for data sets as a technique. For those who don't know it, I recommend checking it out. We also recognize that the politicization of data is happening all around us, so we have to figure out ways to stand up and against it. Not by always saying, we have the perfect knowledge. That's not the counter-argument. The counter-argument is to normalize the idea of talking about uncertainty. Because without it, we're going to be walking into so many data situations where we're fighting over what the data says and doesn't, and we can't actually move forward in policy. And the other thing I would say is that for those who are working with data, keep a clear eye to what's going on. Work with those around you who are doing the same. And many of you are also critical scholars, so think about how to critique all of this. And I'm moving forward because, census in many ways is a canary in a coal mine. The controversies that are going to be surrounding the 2020 census, because we are not done yet, the controversies are very much going to showcase us the battle and politics of data going forward in every other domain. So when we think about doing responsible data science, we should be looking to the struggles that are happening in domains where contestation is already at play. If you don't want to do census, I recommend climate. They both work really well. These fights are so rich and so thick, and understanding how they affect the data, because we cannot just look at the data and imagine that there's a technical solution to a politicizing process. we have to understand how to grapple with the politicizing process inside the data, which means we have to grapple with uncertainty. And with that, thank you. All right, in our remaining time, which is why I cut myself off because I can keep going. Questions, directions. How does this affect the thing you guys are thinking about?
Thank you so much. I'm interested in particular in the way that you're talking about science, in how we should look to it in a certain way. If we omit the uncertainty, we lose the ideal of science. Obviously, science itself, as historians of science have noted, is constructed in lots of kinds of epistemologies that you talk about. What is the science that you're talking about that we should aspire to, and in particular, what is the science that computer scientists should aspire to? Because I'm very interested in computer science as a science, and whether there is an ideal of science and rationality that it should be looking towards.
No, that's really fair, and I think part of it, I don't necessarily appeal to science in its theoretical, but the way that science is willing to deal with uncertainty. And that's where you actually have some very interesting breaks that have happened, both in the experimental methods in natural sciences, but also in more of the data analytics when we're talking about things like climate science. The reason why it's important is that there was a turn, arguably a turn that happens in the early part of the 20th century that starts to recognize that uncertainty is something you have to work with rather than ignore. And that is a really important turn here. And that's an important turn because it also takes a turn into computer science, which is also quite relevant here. For those who aren't familiar with Claude Shannon, he's sort of an interesting character in all of this. He's sort of the founder of information theory in computer science. And I know there's some crypto folks in the room, right? Because a lot of what he does is realize that uncertainty actually is a gift, a possibility. It's not a bug, it's an actual opportunity, right? And that's the origin of crypto, is being able to do that. The basic of information theory is that I am communicating with you. I have all these ideas in my head, and I'm trying to get them across, and I'm communicating you with off a channel, and I'm trying to make certain you receive it. And we have a bunch of things getting in our way, right? A bunch of different possible things that are actually injecting noise into this process, and hopefully you hear that. But part of Shannon's theory was actually recognizing that we have to deal with that noise, that noise is not something to ignore, and this is where encryption is sort of fascinating, but so is actually all the network theories, et cetera, which is how we actually move things. So I think of it in those terms. Computer science, for example, machine learning right now, one of my frustrations with machine learning is that machine learning has been taking on and doing statistics, it's been doing data, but in a sloppy way more often than not. There are not thick ways in machine learning right now to think about how to actually deal with uncertainty. Everyone drops the confidence intervals, right? And that's concerning. Why are we not building better models for understanding and working with whether we've got error, measures of error, whether measures of uncertainty? How do we bake that in? And that's where we also see the biases being introduced back into our system. When our data are biased, we come back in. So the point for me is not to aspire to be a science, but to take the best of certain kinds of scientific turns and to remind ourselves even of our own origins in computer science, bring those back and work with us as we move forward. And that is particularly importantly true right now because computer science in the world of Claude Shannon and a lot of the history, and certainly even when I was at Brown, it wasn't a particularly legitimate field, right? It was esoteric, we were geeky, we didn't leave the CIT, right? It was a thing. Now there is so much power and status, power in data. Everyone thinks data solutionism is all over the place, it's gonna solve all of our problems. And that means that we have a higher moral responsibility, dear Superman, or is it Spider-Man? Spider-Man. We have a more higher responsibility here to figure out these pieces. So that's more what I'm calling to, and you're right that I am hearkening back to a lot of the history of science because honestly the best science, and this is my favorite thing about working with scientists, young scientists are like, oh, we know the answers. And you're like, all scientists are like, everything I do, we learn more questions. Right? And that is the beauty of true science, is that you open up possibilities. And that also to me is also the beauty of data. Data often does not provide closure, it provides openings. Yeah.
How do you see the data features and the uncertainty features in climate science in particular?
Yeah. So, first, a book, A Vast Machine, Paul Edwards. I highly recommend it. It is beautiful. climate data and the development of climate data is really fascinating because it was a history of people randomly starting to see that like things might be weird and there might be these different possibilities. In the early part of the 20th century, they started converging and being like, well, what if we standardize this? Could we compare what we had? And different kinds of measure, whether we're measuring water or soil or whether we're measuring air, et cetera. Like, are there things that we can start to standardize? Okay, well, where do we have measurements? Okay, we have measurements in these countries, but not these countries. You know, what does that tell us? All of this, every time they were doing these turns, right, throughout the 20th century, they're like, well, there's a lot of things we don't know, but here's a few things we do know. And let's keep going with a few things we do know. Can we piece them together and start to see what we don't know? And then can we piece that together and build it together? That was really coming together by the 1970s. And by the 1970s, everybody's like, all paths lead to humans being a problem. That's not great. So then they were asking harder questions. Okay, well, let's build that as a hypothesis. Now let's try to see if we can find other data that challenges our hypothesis. Let's keep going back and say, can we challenge that? Can we challenge it? No, but like, what about over here, right? And that is the scientific inquiry, right? Like just keep challenging the hypothesis. Try to find a new way into it. But the more that they did that, the more by the 1980s they were like, I think you got a problem, right? Like this thing's gonna keep warming. The introduction of the term global warming, right? The idea of the measurements of it. Now they've got to measure it. Can they measure it? Can they see figuring it out? As that becomes a discussion, many people start to realize that there is cost to this. Because if there is cost, if this carbon thing is real, people are going to start building policies to reject this. So there's a bunch of turns that happen simultaneously. And another book that's very good on one of the politicization turns is Merchants of Doubt. It also is a great movie if you want like the hour-and-a-half version. But it's this moment where they recognize that the answer to addressing this problem is to pollute the scientists, to slow down the scientists, to create enough uncertainty that they then have to go and divert and ask, oh, maybe there's another hypothesis that we should follow down. But of course, each of those hypotheses that should be followed down were dead ends, right? They were produced as dead ends. So they took all of the energy that was coming to a consensus and distracted it to try to prove or disprove all of these other potential theories. That sort of emerged, at which point the scientists are going, there is something weird happening here. Why are we now in this like rabbit hole of disproving? Who are these people? What's going on here? Then the turn again happens in the 1990s, but this is where we get politicization, because this is where we're straight into political power. First political move was Frank Luntz, who is a well-known conservative operator who was like, this global warming thing, that's actually scary. People are going to be scared by it, so we need to change the term. So he invented the term climate change. He drumbeat it out to all the politicians. Notice we still now call it climate change because climate change is a lot less scary. They also introduced into a appropriations bill a data quality act, which basically said, oh, if you don't have the best data quality, then you can't possibly make decisions based on it. And if you can't make decisions based on it, then like, you know, we can stop all of these decisions because we can show that there's uncertainty in the data. Okay? That then proceeds from the Data Quality Act into a particular injective into the EPA that basically validates only experimental data. Well, you can't run experimental data on climate. That's like a really bad idea on so many levels and not possible. So that was a way of trying to depress the data being available to there. Latest interesting turn is the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which is produced bipartisan, which is supposed to be like, well, let's just constantly build up the evidence. That works if you share a coherent episteme, if you're actually willing to understand knowledge in a scientific manner. But that also is a way to centralize and dismantle a lot of what's going on. So right now, you will hear tons of like evidence-based solutionism in Congress. Most of this and a lot of its origins and backing, certainly its business backing, is in order to help, again, try to dismantle and undermine climate data. Climate is the center of that fight, full stop. The other thing to keep in mind, which is terrifying about climate data, is that 3 US agencies have 80% of the data sources for climate data around the world, right? That is terrifying. So the precarity of the data right now is also at play as people are trying to fight it through. And for anybody who tracked what happened to the EPA and other climate groups during the previous administration, it's bad. So there's a situation right now where data is missing, uncertainty is being politicized, it's being all narrated within this idea of data quality and goodness in perverted way. And it's all in order just to slow down policy and put backwards pressure on things that will go against business interests. That's, sorry, uplifting. Everything about climate is uplifting.
So I suppose one of the things that we've really touched on, is, the politicization of science, politicization of data, and the resulting politicization of data science. And, I think we can all recognize, data is political, creation of all, like the creative process sees behind all these things is political. But at the same time, I also have briefly worked in the census, right? The thing that we are, people are constantly, sort of trying to say is oh, this isn't a political process. This is not political, right? You have to do that because otherwise you'll definitely lose your job, which is, I understand.
We'll go insane.
Yeah, but I guess my question is so having recognizing that this is political, and finding ourselves in the point that we are, what do we actually, what are the ways in which we actually can act meaningfully even in a political sense,
right,
while being scientists?
So, one of the things that is sort of interesting, I'll bring it to the world of security and computer science. In the early days of security and computer science, the people who were hackers who broke the systems were also the ones who looked for fun ways to repair them. But no matter what, those who were building the systems were I don't want to talk to you at all until I'm done building my thing. And when I'm done building my thing, then we can talk about adding security to it. That tended to end badly. My favorite of which, for fun little history, also a good opportunity to pick on Microsoft, that Microsoft didn't want to talk about security. It was going to solve it later. And then a group of hackers, including a current running politician in Texas, known as Cult of the Dead Cow, decided that they were going to find a way to break something called back office. Microsoft wouldn't listen. They put up a big spectacle. They called it back orifice. Anybody could walk into back orifice and jump into any government agency or any company. They fixed it in 24 hours, right? It was not a really good scene. I point this out because it's often spectacle that makes people respond to goodness. But when you face enough spectacles, and you sit there being we're gonna be in spectacle after spectacle after spectacle, you start to wake up. Even Microsoft has actually put security into its conversation at the beginning. Is it good enough? Not necessarily, right? But has it become part of the process? The reason I bring this back to this conversation is there is a way to try to ignore this entirely and hope it can be worked out on the end, and the politicizations on the end, or there can be a way to slowly realize you've got to think this through, you've got to start analyzing things. I'm a big believer of some of the colloquial practices from security, things like red teaming, right? You bring in people who are going to think like an adversary, and you try to get them to attack your system. And it was interesting because the 2020 census is actually the first census that had red teaming in parts of its processes, which was actually pretty amazing to watch. They red teamed their actual internet self-response system. They red teamed all sorts of mis and disinformation activities. They red teamed their communication strategy. That was then ignored because it turns out communications is actually run by the White House, not by the Census Bureau, so we'll leave that one aside. But they red teamed a lot of these procedures to look for those vulnerabilities, because the reality is that sometimes the people who are building the data aren't going to be able to do it critically. But that's why interdisciplinarity is absolutely essential. That's why teamwork is essential. You want to build teams that are thinking critical at the same time that you have teams that are building ideologically wee, I can solve all the world's problems. If you are one of those people who can just always be passionate about I can fix anything, bless you. That's a great way to be. Stay in land of naivety, enjoy it, but make sure you have a really good friend or somebody on your team that's just yep, I'm gonna break the heck out of that thing, right? So that is more what I think about with it. In a place like Brown, you are a world of people that are bridgers. They're people that are thinking from different angles. That is the beauty of this campus. Relish it, enjoy it, and be a bridge to different places where that can't occur. But if you want to jump in and always be on adversarial land or always be on La La Land, enjoy it too, but just do it as teamwork. And that's where, being able to be in this conversation in this room, a lot of it is to sort of invite you to understand your own position in that equation. And to say, if you keep an eye out, that this is part of a holistic ecosystem, and what role do you want to play, and how do you build a team, and how do you make sure you are on teams that have these different sentiments so you're not dealing with a problem at the other end. Because the reality is that we've been living in worlds of delusion for for a long time, climate scientists had a full reckoning in the 90s. They were like, ah, right? And they've had to really build a whole different set of procedures to do climate work ever since. That is going to occur in every data ecosystem. The census is going through it right now. So my invitation is just to be aware of this, understand it, and prepare for it so that you can build the right buffering to go forward, because data can tell us good things. Data are helpful, but data often open questions. They don't always provide the answers we want them to, and we should be inviting the data to be something that we work with and struggle with and constantly negotiate. Think of it as like a good tango, right? But that moment of being able to be in that conversation with data means that we have to critically understand the limits and the plays of that data and the limits and plays of the people on the other side of that data. With that, I think I'm probably over time, so I should say bye, thank you.